Hope everyone had a good morning and a good lunch. And now we have a special presentation. Last year, for the first time, SABR gave the first SABR Analytics Conference Lifetime Achievement Award to Bill James. And this year, we are presenting our second Lifetime Achievement Award to Pete Palmer. I'm going to have John Thorn, who I think all of you know as a longtime SABR member, the official historian of Major League Baseball, noted author. He's been a good friend of mine for a long time, and I'm going to have him present the award and speak a little to Pete. And then afterwards, we have two mics over here, and if anyone has any questions for John or Pete, we'd be happy to hear from them. So now I'll turn it over to John.
Thanks, folks. Imagine a Mount Rushmore of sabermetrics. Who is on it? There are only four. We can't add heads. Bill James, we would all agree, would be on it, and he was the first recipient of SABR's Lifetime Achievement Award for Analytics. Henry Chadwick? Alan Roth? Arguably. Some individual in today's audience? Possibly. Keep at it for 3 or 4 more decades and you got a shot. That's what Pete Palmer has done. Pete's been at this since 1960, when I was a mere tyke. Since the 1980s, he has been my frequent collaborator and dear pal. Together, we created books of enduring value. Pete continues to do state-of-the-art studies with our brilliant friend, Gary Gillette. After a stimulating dinner last night with Pete and Rob Maines, his collaborator on a presentation later this afternoon, the baseball equivalent of my dinner with Andre, I think, I know that Pete is still at the top of his game, and ours. It is my privilege to present Pete with the SABR Analytics Conference Lifetime Achievement Award. Now let me reach for this fancy dingbat.
Thank you, John.
Privilege and an honor.
Thank you very much. You know, years ago I got an award from SABR, and I remember that I thanked Bill James, John Thorn, and Bob Davids for helping me with the award, and I'd like to add another name right now, and that's Gary Gillette. You know, when I was a kid, there was no TV. All we had was baseball. And in 1951, I discovered the Sporting News. I bought a lot of old baseball guides and started making a ton of lists. And I didn't really do any analysis until around 1960. And my first project was to relate team runs to wins, and I came up with a simple formula, 10 runs per win. Now, it turns out it's not really 10 exactly, but it's 9 or 11. A high-scoring team might need 11, and a low-scoring team might only need 9. And for all you Pythagoreans out there, runs scored minus runs allowed divided by 10 works just as well as the Pythagorean theorem, and it's a lot easier to calculate. And not only that, but you can relate individual performance to team performance very simply. If a guy produces 10 more runs during the course of the season, that's another win. And the second project I worked on was developing my linear weights method, which was assigning a run value to every event. And all I had to work with was a few play-by-plays in the baseball guide from the World Series and a paper and pencil simulation that I got. I mean, you guys are so lucky. There's so much data available, and it's incredible. And there were no play-by-play. You couldn't even get batting versus left and right-handed pitchers in the 60s. And that's really an information explosion. But anyway, in the late 60s, David Neff and John Tattersall got together to produce the Macmillan Encyclopedia, which was a treasure of information never available before in one place. It was amazing. Then in the early 70s, Bob Davids founded SABR, and I joined right away. I became the head of the Statistical Analysis Committee, but there wasn't a heck of a lot going on. And in fact, even today, Phil Birnbaum, who is the current head, is always looking for material. So I know a lot of you guys are working for clubs, but if you come up with something or an idea of something, contact Phil and maybe he can get it into the bulletin. Anyway, early on, I got a letter from Dick Kramer, who had developed on-base time slugging. He wrote a simulation to try to figure out how many runs 9 Babe Ruths would score or 9 Lou Gehrig's, and I had sort of come up with the same thing based on my linear weight study on teams. So we published a joint article in the research journal around then, and of course it really wasn't anything new. Earnshaw Cook had a similar formula in the 60s, and George Lindsay and even F.C. Lane, who was working, legendary baseball magazine editor, had some linear weight stuff back in 1917. And Branch Rickey, with help from Alan Roth, had an article in Life magazine called Goodbye to Old Baseball Ideas, and they came up with a formula which was basically walks plus total bases, and which is very similar to on-base time plus slugging, but they made a mistake. They didn't want to count hits twice. So they did walks plus hits plus extra bases, when it should have been walks plus hits plus total bases, because walks would count double. But anyway, that was one of the steps along the way. After a few years, I decided that on-base plus slugging worked better than on-base time slugging. It was easier to calculate, and it was a little bit better for evaluating how much a player adds to a specific team, whereas on-base time slugging kind of exaggerated the contribution of one player. Then I was lucky to get a copy of the American League microfilm, and had day-by-day records of every American Leaguer back to 1905, and I spent hundreds of hours over several years compiling home and away records for Babe Ruth and Ty Cobb and about 150 players. If I'd waited 40 years, I could have done the whole thing in 15 minutes from all the wonderful stuff that's available to us today. But anyway, there were a lot. You could calculate ballpark effects and stuff, but the most amazing thing to me from that study was that Yankee Stadium was never a good park for left-handed hitters. And in fact, when the average player hits about 10% better at home, that means 5% on batting average or on-base average and 5% on slugging average. Babe Ruth was only 7% better at Yankee Stadium, which was actually less than average. And Lou Gehrig hit like a right-hander. I don't know why it worked out that way, but Gehrig had a .350 lifetime batting average on the road, and he drove in 117 runs in 1930 in road games. And he had 98 2 other years. So, and Ruth, in fact, the Yankees played in the Polo Grounds for 3 years before they built Yankee Stadium. Ruth slugged .985 in the Polo Grounds in 1920. .985, almost 1,000. It's amazing. Anyway, in the late 70s, Bill James came up with his baseball abstract, which he published in his basement until it caught on, and he just showed there was a tremendous audience out there for this analytical stuff. And without Bob Davids and Bill James, I don't think we'd be here today. They were just terrific. And in the early 80s, I met John Thorn at a SABR meeting, and with the success that Bill had with his book and John's knowledge of the publishing industry and his ability as a writer, we were able to do The Hidden Game of Baseball. But without the what went before, that book never would have come out. So I thought that was very helpful. And I worked part-time at the American League office in Quincy. I kept the stat. The American League were the first ones to do it on computer, and we introduced on-base average as an official statistic in 1979, and the National League came on about 3 or 4 years later. Bill James inspired Project Scoresheet, which started in 1984, a grassroots effort by all his he had like 100,000 copies that they were selling, so he had a big pool of people to draw from, and they collected play-by-play, sometimes in the ballpark, generally off TV. John DeWan managed that for a number of years, and then he went on. My buddy Dick Kramer founded Stats in the early 80s, and Kramer and Bill James went over to, DeWan and Bill James went over to Stats, and Gary Gillette kept Project Scoresheet going through the 90s. Dave Smith worked on founding Retrosheet, which was a project to get play-by-plays of all games before 1984. And then in the late 90s, John and Mike Gershman from Total Baseball and Gary and his network from Project Scoresheet on my historical database, which I've been working on for like 15 years, all joined together with an outfit from North Carolina who was working on Atlantic Coast basketball, real-time internet presentation, and the idea was that they would do that with baseball. And unfortunately, it didn't work out. The dot-com bubble crashed, and they ended up selling Gary's network and my database and a bunch of programs that Tom Tippett, Dave Nichols, and Dave Smith had written for Project Scoresheet to MLB. And that became MLB AM, which is just done tremendous work, adding tons more stuff, more data available, and that was a bit of a disappointment that we weren't able to do that. Anyway, so Gary and I continued on. We supplying data to various internet companies like Sports Reference and ESPN Stats, and we're still doing that today. I studied relief strategy, and you know, it's really weird. The first game where there were 15 pitchers in a 9-inning game was 1993, and there were 2 more in the 90s, and then 1 a year up until 2014. In the last 3 years, there have been 21 games in the major leagues with 15 or more pitchers. And that's, to me, that's crazy. You know, and the idea that you take your best pitcher and cut his innings down and only bring him in when the game's almost always already won, that's my big criticism of what the major leagues are doing today. In fact, I developed a thing called a true save. A true save is when you come into the game and your team's ahead, but their probability of winning is less than 50%. In the 70s, the ace reliever was brought in 36% of the time in those situations. The fireman, the Joe Page, it's a real save. But now they only brought in about 5% of the time. And, a team with a 3-run lead in the 9th inning is going to win about 98% of the time, whether you bring in the closer or not. But anyway, so Gary and I are still working on various internet projects, and hopefully we'll continue. I turned 80 in January, and hopefully I got a few years left. So, the work itself is a reward, but it's really nice to get recognition by your peers. And so thanks to Mark and SABR, and thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
If there are any questions for Pete or John, we've got 2 microphones out there, so happy to entertain those.
So,
Okay, can you help me,
Pete,
John?
congratulations, Pete. I want people to know that not only all the baseball stats, historical baseball stats, full season stats come from Pete's work, and I consider those the official numbers in Major League history. And there's always new stuff that Pete's finding and Pete's incorporating into the data set. We also get our NFL data, historical NFL data from Pete. We get a lot of NBA data from Pete as well. So he's not just a baseball researcher, he's a sports researcher par excellence. And in order to add a question to this, how many hits does Ty Cobb have in his career?
How many hits does Ty Cobb have?
Well, one thing I found out when I was doing the home away stuff on the microfilm was there were a lot of mistakes in the official records, and the American League, especially before 1920, had very sloppy record keeping. And so I don't think anybody really knows, but I just happened to run it. You can identify a mistake, but that doesn't mean there aren't 100 more that you don't identify. But it was funny because I was doing the home away stuff, and I did Ty Cobb and had all the stats. And then I went to Sam Crawford, and Sam Crawford, in order to do the home away, I had to put down the dates of all home games and all the road games, or the homestand. And the Tigers had a 13-game homestand in September, and Sam Crawford had 14 games in that homestand. So I looked at it, and I saw that one game had been entered twice. And I didn't pick it up on Cobb because Cobb missed a couple of games, so his total was less, and it wasn't so obvious. And so he turns out he went 2 for 3 in that game, and if you subtract those 2 hits, that year Lajoie and Cobb were neck and neck on the batting average, and strangely enough, if you added the 2 for 3 in, Cobb was ahead, and if you took the 2 for 3 out, Lajoie was ahead. And it's funny because there was so much interest in the batting race. If you look in the official sheet of the microfilm, Cobb and Lajoie have a little check mark by every game saying, yes, we verified those are the right totals, and Cobb won. But sometime shortly thereafter that, they discovered the mistake, because if you look at Crawford's record, they took that game out. But they couldn't very well take the game out of Cobb's record because they had already publicized that they had checked it all out and it's okay. So, but you know, that was just a kind of a fluke where one little change made a big difference. But as far as all the mistakes go, though, you know, if you want to say how good a player was, oh yeah, Herm Kravinoff, Saber member, did a study of Lou Gehrig RBIs, and he found 50 mistakes in Lou Gehrig's RBIs for his career. But you know, some were added and some subtracted, and it's not going to change your idea of how good somebody was. But as far as any individual stat, especially in that era, it's really an approximation.
Yeah, my personal congratulations. I've been a member of SABR since the 80s, and I think I first saw you at the Oakland conference way back in '85, and the discussion on linear weights was fresh and new then. And I've seen your material, I've seen your other presentations, and so personal congratulations for me. But I got confused with what you were saying about the Yankee Stadium and left-handed hitters. The Yankees over the year have been famous for their left-handed hitters. Maris, Reggie Jackson, Yogi Berra. The right-handed home run total, I think the highest was 46 for a right-handed hitter, and that was DiMaggio and tied by Dave Winfield. Otherwise, all the home run records were left-handed hitters.
So
I'm
summing
confused.
up, can I say that your question is, why is it true that Yankee Stadium is not a benefit to right-handed hitters with the possible exception of home runs?
Yeah, absolutely.
Why is Yankee Stadium not beneficial for
No,
left-handed?
I'm not getting it.
Why is Yankee Stadium not beneficial to right-handed hitters, to left-handed hitters, with the exception of home runs for pull hitters? Why is Yankee Stadium difficult for a Ruth, a Gehrig?
Well, I think when people look at Yankee Stadium, you see the right field corner, which is really close. But it's funny because if you plot Fenway Park and Yankee Stadium on top of each other, Yankee Stadium is actually deeper than Fenway Park as you go towards center field. But as far as Gehrig goes, I think he must have hit the ball to the opposite field. I mean, but every single Yankee left-handed hitter, Bill Dickey, Roger Maris, Mickey Mantle, who was a switch batter, Yogi Berra, none of them did exceptionally well in Fenway Park. And, you know, as I said, now you guys have, thanks to Dave Smith and, I forgot to mention Tom Ruane at Retrosheet, who has now had box scores back to 1908. There's so much data available anyway, so I ran it on the computer. Like I say, if I'd waited 30 years, I could have saved myself hundreds of hours of time. Anyway, I finally found a Yankee left-handed batter who did well at Yankee Stadium. That was Bobby Mercer. But I think it's somewhat of an illusion because, you know, it may be short and in the right field corner, but that doesn't apply to that many balls.
So when we're talking about left-handed hitters doing well at Yankee Stadium, if you look only at their home run totals, yeah, you've got Roger Maris, right? You've got others whose OPS does not match up, and I think you need to look at total offensive production and not just the single statistic of home runs.
I was hoping that for the sake of posterity, that you could both talk about the inspiration for and the creation of the greatest baseball encyclopedia ever published, Total Baseball.
Could you talk about the inspiration for the creation of Total Baseball?
Well, gee, I think you could answer that better than me.
Let me take first crack at it. It's kind of an interesting publishing story in that we proposed such an encyclopedia to Simon & Schuster in late 81, early 1982. And they gave us what was then all the money in the world. They gave us, I think, $106,000 as an advance, which was good in those days. And their only caveat was that we had to produce it within 15 months. And we knew that we would spend all that money to produce it and probably wouldn't make the deadline and then would have to give the money back. So instead, we did the Hidden Game of Baseball, which was an entirely different concept. And when the Hidden Game of Baseball created something of a splash, New York Times picking up all of its alternative statistics, we tried again to sell Total Baseball, and this time Warner Books offered $465,000 for it, which was much cushier, and we were able to do a better book in a longer time frame. So that is the publishing history of how Total Baseball came to be, and its conception is that while Pete and I are co-editors, he is largely and almost solely the editor of the statistical portion, and I was the editor of the prose portion. I've discussed the publishing history, how we came
Oh,
to
yeah, I know. That was a hassle.
But
But anyway, I played softball after work for 45 years, and when I retired, I was 65, and I played a little too long, and I was a pitcher then, and I got a line drive off my ear, and it affected my hearing, unfortunately, but it was still, 45 years of playing softball was worth a little bit of inconvenience, but it is a little bit of a problem once in a while.
Mark, how are we for time? Do we have any other questions? If not, we will gladly yield the stage. Thank you.